Well, we're going to move on now to Tania Sturt. She's from New Zealand. She's been involved in gender identity politics for about 6 years. She's a founding member of Women's Liberation Aotearoa, and she's currently working in the architectural industry, but prior to that spent a decade in corrections, mainly as a probation officer with an interest in managing sex offenders. She's particularly interested in grassroots activism, and today Tanya is so fantastic that it's the middle of the night in New Zealand, so has woken up specially to be with us. She's going to talk about the challenges and successes and the way forward for offline protesting and activism in New Zealand in regards to women's rights and gender identity ideology. So thank you so much, Tanya, and over to you.
Yes, so I live in Wellington, but I was brought up and spent most of my life in Auckland. And Wellington is quite a woke area. Luckily we have quite a strong feminist movement here as well. Women's Liberation Aotearoa was founded in early 2020. We were a group of about 13 women who felt there was space for a feminist organisation in New Zealand that had a multi-issue approach to feminism. We're a left-wing organisation and we operate democratically within the group, which means that we vote on issues and there's no one spokesperson. We all have the ability to do whatever we need to do. We've got a membership of about 55 women now. So currently we're lobbying for women's rights in the prisons, particularly after recent reports of poor treatment that breached the Human Rights Act in the women's prison in Auckland. We also support the Nordic model in prostitution, we're anti-pornography, and we're concerned with issues of homelessness and poverty and male violence against women and children, which is something that New Zealand has a poor record in. Recently, we've spent a lot of time on gender critical ideology issues, necessarily because that's the largest threat to women's spaces and rights. Part of that was around when the government called for submissions for 2 bills before Parliament. Some of us individually and some of us represented Women's Liberation provided written and verbal submissions to the Select Committee. The 2 bills that were relevant to that were the Births, Deaths, Marriages, Relationships Registration Bill, which allowed people to change their sex on their birth certificates by self-identification, and the Conversion Practices Prohibition Legislation Bill, which seeks to criminalise anyone, including parents, for not actively affirming gender identity. Someone managed to look at the statistics on those submissions. There were submissions from all over New Zealand and some from overseas as well. And the statistics indicated that there were around 70% of submitters were against those bills. However, the recommendations, at least for the BDM bill, have been announced and it's likely to go ahead as planned. That's not particularly surprising given the reception that the submitters received from the panel. I think it was all over YouTube, some of the experiences people had, and it was fairly hostile reception to people who were anti the bill changes, and they were clearly quite biased, and it was frankly quite rude and dismissive, and it was pretty embarrassing for New Zealand to see some MPs acting like that. Ahead of us, we've got changes to surrogacy legislation, and we've got a hate speech bill coming up as well. So there'll be work around that we need to do. We work quite closely with Mana Wahine Korero, which is a group founded by Maori women who work towards protecting the mana or status of Maori women in New Zealand, and their principles align quite well with WLA. It's a newish group, but it's full of strong, very staunch women, and they're doing some great work. We also align with LAVA, which is Lesbian Action for Visibility in Aotearoa. And they've been around for quite a few years, and they've got a bit of a resurgence going on at the moment. And again, very strong, very supportive women doing a lot of really excellent work. Women's Lib supported their protest outside the Ministry for Women on International Women's Day this year, and that went quite well. WLA and Manawahine coordinated a national event for Suffrage Day in September. This went ahead in Dunedin and Wellington only, though it was meant to be in most of the main centres. We had some issues with COVID and lockdown, and Auckland were unable to participate in any meaningful way. Hopefully next year, things will be improving around the COVID situation, and we'll be hoping to get things up and going, and hopefully bigger and better next year as well. Because we're a small country in population and geography, really, we're relatively spread out. And so there are challenges around political actions. It's hard for people to get in touch with other women. It hasn't helped with lockdown issues. People can't move into city. We can't support each other in person as much as we'd like. We also have sort of challenges around New Zealand being quite a laid-back culture. As a nation, we tend not to lean into conflict or overt emotion particularly easily. And it's combining that with the issues around being publicly out as gender critical means that it's difficult to get people involved in protests and public events and public actions. We know there are more people out there who see the fallacies of the gender identity movement. It's just getting in touch with them. And it's really, in my opinion, important to take it to the streets to try and get in touch with the general public. There are people sitting on the fence. There are people who it's not affecting, and they may have some discomfort around it, but they don't yet feel the need to speak up. We also have issues with media not giving us a platform, though we have had a couple of breakthroughs, not least of which when we were recently accused of criminal activity, and the media sought our comment on that, so we gave it to them. We didn't do it, by the way. The counter-protestings by the trans rights activists have been increasingly well organised over the last year. The International Women's Day protest had a group of counter-protesters of approximately the same size as us. It was relatively amicable. There was one woman who kicked off, started screaming at us, telling us we were all old and going to die soon, and she was very happy about that. Otherwise, it was fairly tame. A large group of trans protesters organised against the Speak Up for Women talks. Speak Up for Women is the largest feminist organisation in New Zealand, to my knowledge anyway. And they were quite loud, they were quite organised, and they had loudspeakers and had speeches and things like that. They had shocking singing skills. I've got to say, you know, if you're going to sing 1960s protest songs, try to remember the words and the tune. That would really help. Just saying. The recent street actions, it became clear that they were getting more efficient, really. As soon as anything became public, they were immediately, any of our actions became public, they were immediately on the ball and organising counter-protests. The way forward, you know, I think we're just going to keep doing what we can. It's hard to know what's going to happen in 2022. We've got COVID issues, as I said before, and we've got issues around protests around the mandated vaccines and things like that that may be taking precedence in the general public's eyes at the moment. We're just going to keep going and trying to build up the contacts and getting people involved, and that's really important.
The fact that your prime minister is a woman who is seen by the world, certainly in Hungary, as a feminist politician, as an example, does this have any effect on the laws like gender ID, surrogacy, etc.?
It doesn't appear to. We have tried many times to make contact with the Labour Party, the MPs in the Labour Party. They're just refusing to speak to us. That they don't really want to hear from us. There's not a lot coming from them. It's a hot potato politically, a lot of that feminist stuff, and they really don't want to say too much, particularly because the state of politics at the moment, she's got enough on her plate. There doesn't seem to be much interest.
What do the majority of lesbians or sort of traditional or feminists, sort of activist women in New Zealand, what's their position? Are they pro this gender ideology?
It seems to be pretty similar across the board. Yeah, I mean, I don't know every lesbian, obviously, but it does appear to be that there's more of an age divide. So the older generation is anti, and the younger generation, this is very generalised, and the younger generation are pro. So there's that division rather than sexual orientation or class even, really. It seems to be an age thing.